Hello there. Now, I love the Percy Jackson books. I mean, I've been fascinated by Greek mythology since I was a kid, and I watched Troy with my parents for the first time. See, Troy created this fascination with Greek mythology that led me to reading the Odyssey and the Iliad. Two books that I honestly still reread at least once a year to this day. But this fascination was further compounded by shows and movies like Class of the Titans and Disney's Hercules. So, when my mom came home one day with the first three Percy Jackson books as a present for me, I was hooked. I mean, it was like my love for Harry Potter and Greek mythology had just melded perfectly together to just give me an incredible book series. I mean, Percy Jackson is still a book series on my rotation, even now at the age of 25. And honestly, I still feel like I find new things to appreciate from the books every time I read them. So as a kid, I mean, when I saw The Lost Hero out in bookstores, I was seriously excited. And I mean, I devoured each book as it came out. But, I mean, even as a kid, something didn't feel the same, you know? And I mean, it's only now, over 10 years later, that I've kind of finally been able to put that feeling into words. So, in this video, I'm going to break down what made the Percy Jackson books just work so well, and why Heroes of Olympus failed to live up to the high standards set by that first series. But before we can dive into that, let's first look at what exactly is Percy Jackson and the Olympians, and the Heroes of Olympus. Percy Jackson and the Olympians is a series that started in 2005 with the publication of Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, and it ended in 2009 with the publication of The Last Olympia. Percy Jackson follows a young boy, named Percy Jackson, as he finds out that he's actually the son of the Greek sea god Poseidon, and the various quests he undertakes in order to defeat the Titan Lord Kronos. Now, Riordan actually wrote Percy Jackson for his son, who had reading difficulties and just a deep fascination for Greek mythology, kind of as a way for his son to connect with the character. Now, the books kind of take Greek mythology and famous Greek figures, and honestly some relative unknowns, and thrust them into the modern day. The gods and Mount Olympus now reside above the Empire State Building. The entrance to the underworld is now in Los Angeles. And I mean, the Sea of Monsters is in the Bermuda Triangle off the coast of Miami, Florida. You know, you get the point. And I mean, there's also this camp where demigod children kind of go to train to fight monsters, and is really just kind of the closest thing to home for many of them, due to, obviously, monsters constantly trying to attack and kill demigod children. Now, each book kind of follows a quest that's guided by a prophecy from kind of the camp oracle, who's like this shriveled up mummy of a hippie woman, with each quest really having a very similar feel to the Odyssey, as the characters are kind of taken off course, encounter monsters, and ultimately just have to deal with interference, either helping or hindering, of the gods, as well as, obviously, you know, the armies of Kronos himself. Now, the Titan Lord Kronos is kind of the overarching antagonist of the book series, as he tries to, you know, resurrect himself from Tartarus in an attempt to destroy the gods, overthrow Mount Olympus, and really just kind of reshape Western civilization to something more to his own liking. And I mean, in this quest, he's kind of turned Luke Castellan, I don't know, a son of Hermes, over to his side by really just preying on his hatred of the gods and his feelings of abandonment that he gets from his father. And I mean, this is a consistent theme throughout the books, as half-bloods either ally with Kronos or Olympus, yet all have to grapple with this resentment and abandonment they feel towards their parents. Throughout the story, Percy's got to learn and grow in order to stand up to the Titan and defeat him. Especially as he's believed to be the child spoken of in a great prophecy that will pretty much make the ultimate choice to either save Olympus or raze it to the ground. I mean, the gods themselves are split as to whether or not Percy should even be allowed to live, because Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades had basically made this pact to not father any more heroes after World War II, which is basically revealed to have just been this war between the children of Zeus and Poseidon on the one side, and the children of Hades on the other. I'll let you guess which side was which. Now, Percy's obviously our POV character, and each adventure really helps to shine a spotlight on a different character, as events really force characters to sit quests out in one way or another, really kind of allowing relationships and dynamics to build naturally throughout the course of the series. One of the most integral relationships is between Percy and a girl called Annabeth Chase, a daughter of Athena, who kind of fall in love over the course of the series, but it's a love complicated by her strong feelings for Luke. The series ended with another great prophecy being spouted by the new Oracle, acting as a kind of springboard for the sequel series, Heroes of Olympus. So with that, I think it's pretty much time to talk about Heroes of Olympus. Now, Heroes of Olympus is a sequel series to Percy Jackson that started in 2010 with the publication of The Lost Hero, and ended in 2014 with the publication of Blood of Olympus. Now, unlike the Percy Jackson series, Heroes of Olympus encompasses multiple POVs, including Percy and Annabeth, as it kind of chronicles the collision of the Greek camp, Camp Half-Blood, and the Roman camp, Camp Jupiter, both of which are kind of positioned in opposition to one another by the machinations of Gaia and the giants at her service. Now, each camp kind of sends demigods to join the quest to fulfill the new great prophecy and stop Gaia from obviously destroying the gods and both camps. The 7 demigods kind of make up our new POV characters, with returning character Nico being added to the quest, as well as a character named Reyna, who is new, but it's kind of retconned as well, but she's basically the leader of Camp Jupiter, and she joins Nico in his quest to kind of return the Athena Parthenos in the last book. And kind of because of this, both Nico and Reyna are given POV chapters in the final book, because obviously they've been separated from the other demigods. Now, while Gaia and the giants are causing havoc, the gods have kind of shut themselves off from their children due to their embarrassment at having needed demigods to save them from destruction. As well as there's this kind of conflict between the Roman and Greek camps, obviously, which leaves the gods incapacitated as their Roman and Greek aspects begin kind of vying for control within a single body. And honestly, this provides a way to give characters fresh interactions with gods that they may have already encountered, while also really kind of bringing a spotlight onto Roman mythology and culture. I mean, especially because the Roman camp is modeled so heavily on those Roman cultures and practices. And I mean, this is a really good writing tool because it kind of further enables a way to contrast the two camps as characters like Percy and Jason begin to wonder if maybe the other camp isn't a more ideal place to live. And, while the characters all need to learn and trust each other through their adventures, I mean, especially because they're all kind of just living together on the Argo 2, which is this flying ship created by Leo Valdez, a son of Hephaestus. Now, while the Percy Jackson series really focused on Percy and all of his various relationships, It kind of left his romantic relationships fairly in the background, owing, like, obviously to, like, Percy's, like, clueless nature when it comes to girls. And I mean, the romantic tension only really comes to the forefront in the last 2 books, I think. Last book and a half, I guess, as the stakes are kind of raised to this point where just, like, emotions get to their highest point in the series. Heroes of Olympus, however, has its romantic relationships at the forefront from the start, as characters are kind of all just paired off with one another. And I mean, even though Leo is the odd man out, he spends so many of his chapters pining for love, as he just begins to feel the strain of being the only single person on a boat full of seemingly well-matched couples. Don't worry, this is then dealt with as he falls in love with Calypso, a character introduced in Percy Jackson and the Battle of the Labyrinth. We'll get to that. Ultimately, the demigods must kind of work together with their godly parents, as it's only really through the combined might of a god and a demigod that the giants can be slain. I mean, in doing so, and with Nico and Reyna completing their peace mission between the 2 camps, you know, the world is saved, both camps begin an open and healthy relationship. I mean, Percy and Annabeth decide to go to college at Camp Jupiter, and Jason decides to, like, act as this kind of... They've got a name for it, but he's basically like an ambassador moving between each camp. But I mean, with all that in mind, why doesn't Heroes of Olympus stack up to Percy Jackson? Now, I actually found it, like, really difficult to kind of break down the flaws of Heroes of Olympus into, like, neat little categories, because it kind of feels like each issue just kind of intertwines itself with another, just further compounding each issue. I mean, this is probably why it's taken me so long to identify just, like, why the series never really worked for me in the first place. But, having said that, I do think that the best place to start is kind of with the antagonists of each series. Because I really think I've been able to, like, break the antagonists down into basically 3 categories, right? Those being minor antagonists, major antagonists, and obviously the overarching antagonist. Now, minor antagonists are kind of like the bad guys and monsters our heroes encounter on their journeys that really just waylay them, or, like, provide this obstacle that needs to be overcome in order to kind of continue to the next portion of their quest. So, antagonists who kind of fall into this category range from, like, the Minotaur and Medusa to King Midas and the Prophet Phineas, for example, right? Now, these minor antagonists are honestly excellent in both series, and really provide a good way for Riordan to put the Greek and Roman mythology just on full display, with each minor antagonist, like, harkening back to some myth, and often requiring, like, a really creative way to be defeated. And I mean, while the minor antagonists excel in both series, it's really the major antagonists and the overarching antagonists who really show the failings of the Heroes of Olympus series. The overarching antagonist of Percy Jackson is the Titan Lord Kronos, who kind of seeks revenge on the gods for usurping him and cutting him up into pieces before just casting him into Tartarus. And I mean, every major antagonist is essentially just a piece on the board of Kronos' machinations. I mean, due to Kronos not really having a body for most of the series, Luke really acts as kind of the enforcer of his will, usually, like, doing the Titan's bidding in order to just, like, advance Kronos' grand plan, right? All of this culminates in Kronos taking over Luke's body in the final book, acting as this, like, physical manifestation of just, like, the corruption of Luke's soul. But because of the setup and, you know, like, Kronos' need for a body, each major antagonist in each novel simultaneously, like, has their own agency while still doing Kronos' bidding. Like, Ares is manipulated into acting on Kronos' behalf due to just, like, his warlike nature, making him, like, very susceptible to Kronos' plans of framing Percy for the theft of Zeus's lightning bolt. And I mean, Ares is so eager to see a war between the Olympians, and I mean, the result is he would just gain so much power from such a war, you know? I mean, Polyphemus is the guardian of the Golden Fleece, which, you know, Kronos kind of wants to speed up his recovery from Tartarus. So he just puts the heroes on a collision course with the Cyclops, just kind of in the hopes of having them do all the hard work so that Luke can just swoop in the end and steal the fleece without any trouble. Atlas is like a fellow Titan and the general of Kronos' armies who needs to be freed from his imprisonment beneath the sky, while Kronos really just tempts Thalia Grace, a daughter of Zeus, with unlimited power with which to destroy the Olympians. Now, the Battle of the Labyrinth is just a little harder to nail down in terms of, like, who the major antagonist is. I mean, I can see arguments to be made for, like, Luke, Daedalus, and Camper. However, like, regardless of who you believe the major antagonist to be, I mean, each has their own goals in the book, you know, with Luke trying to navigate the maze to invade Camp Half-Blood. Daedalus kind of just looking to side with Kronos in order to, like, escape punishment for killing his nephew. And Campe really just looking to deliver fire and blood due to the heroes rescuing Briare's 100-handed one from, like, his imprisonment under her watch. Now, the end of the Battle of the Labyrinth kind of sees Kronos take over Luke's body, allowing him to join in the fight in the final book and lay siege to Mount Olympus. I mean, various titans like Prometheus and Hyperion take on the role of major antagonist in the final book. And I mean, you've also got, like, Typhon being unleashed to keep the gods preoccupied. Now, Kronos is an incredible overarching antagonist, as, like, his machinations just set up all of the major antagonists to be incredible forces to be reckoned with, you know? With kind of each major antagonist really having their own interesting reason for supporting him, and requiring our heroes to really, like, push themselves beyond their limits to finally defeat them. And it's for that very reason that the major antagonists of the Heroes of Olympus series just don't work anywhere near as well. Now, I mean, on paper, like, it makes sense, right? How do you top the threat of the Titans and, like, just the machinations of Kronos? Well, you provide an antagonist that requires the assistance of the gods themselves to be defeated. And I mean, this seems like it should work so well, especially because, like, each giant is basically born, like, with the express purpose of destroying and usurping, like, a specific god. However, none of the giants are anywhere near as interesting as the antagonists from Percy Jackson. Like, look, I'm a pretty weird dude, so even though I've never really connected with Heroes of Olympus, like, as much as I did with Percy Jackson, I still reread the entire series once I finish The Last Olympian. So this means that, like, I've pretty much read the Heroes of Olympus series almost as much as I've read Percy Jackson. But the thing is, no matter how long it's been since I've read Percy Jackson, like, I can tell you all about the antagonists, why they did what they did, you know, what they hoped to achieve, and how they were beaten. But, like, I've literally just finished rereading Heroes of Olympus, and I can't remember the name of a single one of the giants. I think there was Antioch? I think one of the biggest reasons for this is that none of them feel distinct, you know? None of them feel like they have different motivations from each other. As the giants, like, all of their motivation really just boils down to, I want to kill this god and take over their domain because they are the god I was born to defeat. Like, that's just really boring. Like, especially when compared to just the rich and multi-layered antagonists from Percy Jackson, who always felt like they'd be up to something if Kronos hadn't pushed them in a certain direction. And I mean, on top of that, each giant is defeated at the end of a book before being just resurrected for the final battle so that they can be defeated again. Like, it's really hard to take them seriously as antagonists in that final battle because we saw how easy it was to defeat them before. Like, it didn't really push our heroes. And that's in stark contrast to the Percy Jackson books, where, you know, after their defeat, the major antagonists never really made a significant comeback. I mean, especially not in the role of an antagonist. Like, while most people, you know, would have been able to forgive the giants being a bit bland and just kind of unthreatening, the real killer for the fate of the antagonists in the Heroes of Olympus series is the overarching bad guy, Gaia herself. See, not only does she come off as just this watered down version of Kronos, like, I mean, she's bad guy who doesn't have a full power and can't really take physical form, thus relying on manipulation of events to achieve her goals, you know, just like Kronos. But she also doesn't really have clear-cut motivations. She hates the gods because of what they did to the Titans twice, and like, I get that. But it's never really expanded on, like, at all. I mean, if it's simply because she loves her family, then the fact that the gods are her grandchildren should throw a bit of a wrinkle into her plans, no? I mean, if it's literally just that she loves her children alone, then I think more could really have been done to just expand on that. Especially considering her disdain for, what was it, like, Orion, and I think it's like Damison? Because they supported the gods the first time round. And, you know, while Kronos had Luke to essentially kind of act as his face while he wasn't able to be, like, present throughout the series, Gaia didn't have that with any character. Like, you can try and make the argument that Octavian filled that role, but he really didn't. He wasn't working directly for Gaia the way Luke was working for Kronos. And I mean, none of the other characters took him that seriously. Even when he was bearing down on Camp Half-Blood with like an army of Roman legionnaires, Luke was able to explain Kronos' motivations to the audience. He was like able to commit atrocities that were then able to be associated with Kronos, make his defeat at the end of Percy Jackson like cathartic. Gaia had none of that, and her defeat was just pathetic. I mean, it took everything the heroes had to defeat Kronos, like including convincing Luke that he made a mistake and that he needed to help destroy Kronos. It took next to nothing to defeat Gaia, with like comments like Leo's in the Trials of Apollo about, you know, how the heroes defeated her in like 40 seconds. It doesn't help, you know? There's also the fact that Gaia only awakens because Percy gets a nosebleed when battling the giants in a scene that just had none of the grandeur of Kronos' resurrection, nor any of the weight behind it. And, you know, while Kronos felt like he manipulated events to give himself wins no matter what, Gaia felt genuinely stupid as an antagonist. I mean, Kronos would have won if he hadn't underestimated each of the heroes, Luke included, in their, like, own way. Gaia lost because she was an idiot who decided to take on physical form to just duke it out with the heroes for no reason. I mean, it was hard to take Gaia seriously. I can't be the only one who feels that way. And the only moment that I, at least, felt like she had some character and some menace to her was when Percy kind of, like, manipulated her into helping him, like, win the bet with the poison vials against Phineas, because, like, he knew she needed him more than she needed Phineas. Kronos had tons of incredible moments to show off his ruthlessness and cunning that always left him feeling like a legitimate threat. Couple Gaia with the bland nature of the giants, and you had a group of antagonists who never came off as threatening or even remotely interesting. And honestly, it's a shame, because the potential was there. Now, with the main antagonist of the Heroes of Olympus series having been a failure, a saving grace for the series absolutely could have been its handling of the Roman mythology, right? Like, Percy Jackson was built around the Greek mythology, and it worked wonders, allowing like more and more people to gain an interest in the myths, while kind of just like updating some of them and showing how they could really work in today's setting. It provided the universe with a rich tapestry from which to draw from, and kind of acted as the perfect set dressing for the story Riordan was telling. That didn't work quite so well with Heroes of Olympus. Now, look, to be fair to Rick, he seems to be like genuinely enthusiastic about mythology in general, and has proven himself like capable of utilizing other mythologies and tying them into the pre-existing world of Percy Jackson, like he did with the Egyptian mythologies in the Kane Chronicles, and, you know, the Norse mythology in Magnus Chase. But Roman mythology proved to be a problem. See, in Percy Jackson, it's explained that the gods kind of follow what they deem the flame of Western civilization, right? Going to wherever that flame really burns the brightest. The flame started in Greece, then moved to Rome, and so on and so forth until they ended up currently in America. And, you know, one would think that by fudging things a bit to keep each mythology kind of distinct and separate, this idea could work. Now, I say fudging things because, I mean, there is like this Greek myth that states, like, when Typhon first came to destroy the gods, most of them basically like fled to Egypt and adopted forms with animal heads in order to hide from him. And this obviously kind of like explains the Egyptian pantheon from like a Greek mythological standpoint. God, I'm a nerd. But like, if you ignore that and just make the Egyptian pantheon like its own thing, and, you know, say that, you know, the gods of different mythologies just don't interact with each other, you can avoid a lot of problems. But Roman mythology becomes a problem because it's baked into the world building of the first Percy Jackson book. The Greek gods moved to Rome and adopted new names and, you know, slightly different personalities, but, you know, I mean, this kind of goes a little way toward explaining, like, Percy's brief spouting and understanding of Latin that happens in The Lightning Thief. Honestly, that is something that has never really made sense in the series. I don't know if that's just me. But, like, it means that Roman mythology can't be kept separate from Greek mythology all that well in the Percy Jackson universe. And, to be honest, having the Greek gods become conflicted due to their Greek and Roman aspects kind of just having conflicting goals, it didn't work for me. I mean, maybe it could have if the series focused on and kind of just explored it more thoroughly, but it always just struck me as somewhat unnecessary, in all honesty. And, you know, the issues of Greek and Roman aspects become even more muddied and really just confusing when it's revealed that Zeus was able to sire Jason because he was in his Roman aspect at the time, and the Roman aspects of the gods had never made a pact to not have any more children. So, like, theoretically, right, there should be a whole lot more Roman demigods of the big three just running around out there, right? Like, I mean, this is all literally more confusing because Talia and Percy both, like, they both have to suffer in various ways because they were the result of a broken oath. but I guess Jason didn't? But I mean, the demigod situation in Camp Jupiter, like, it just opens up a whole other can of worms, because there aren't actually that many demigods in Camp Jupiter. Like, Camp Jupiter is mostly made up of legacies. So in other words, it's like children of demigods, or like descendants of demigods. And this kind of has the unintended effect of just making Camp Jupiter come off as somewhat lame in comparison to Camp Half-Blood, which, I mean, is made up entirely of demigods. And I mean, this breeds a whole different problem, as we, the audience, are told in, like, small snippets that Camp Jupiter was instrumental to Kronos' defeat. But it doesn't feel like it, because we know what Percy and the Greeks had to go through in order to, like, stand up to the Titans in what felt like all of the most pivotal battles, and yet the Romans kind of come in after the fact, and we, the audience, are told, don't worry, Percy couldn't have won if the Romans hadn't been fighting equally awesome and pivotal battles in the background. Like, it just doesn't work as a narrative retcon, because, like, the only thing even approaching a hint to this in the Percy Jackson books is kind of, in The Last Olympian, there's like a passing comment made that, you know, Mount Othrys crumbled. But, because even when Percy Jackson, like, ended, I assumed that happened because the Titans were defeated. Like, the gods are, like, tied to their thrones of power, so if they were gone, like, the thrones collapse and vice versa. I assumed the same for the Titans. So it doesn't really feel like a great victory for the Romans when, you know, they say they stormed Mount Othrys and destroyed it, because I assumed that it would have crumbled regardless. And I mean, another problem when comparing the two camps is just kind of the lack of future thought given to demigods. Like, I mean, Camp Jupiter has this, like, university for demigods, as well as, like, this city for them to live in and grow old in. And it's honestly one of my favorite aspects about Camp Jupiter. But it makes Camp Half-Blood feel, like, poorly thought out, as there's, like, a definite time limit seemingly placed on, like, the number of years a demigod can attend and stay at camp. And it honestly creates, like, the slight disassociation, because the demigods of the Greek camp just kind of go and live their life after a certain age out in the real world, despite, I mean, theoretically still attracting monsters, right? While the Romans stay in their safety net essentially for life, despite most of them not actually being demigods, and theoretically, like, not attracting monsters, right? Like, it honestly feels like it should have been the other way around. And I mean, to cap it all off, I think one of the worst parts about Heroes of Olympus is that we just don't get to grow to care for Camp Jupiter, like, as an audience. Like, throughout the Percy Jackson series, Camp Half-Blood provides, like, this safe haven and rest stop for Percy while he's growing up. But, like, we also get to spend a significant chunk of time there, you know? Like, learning about the daily activities, meeting the characters who live there and make it such an interesting place. Like, this helps us connect to the camp and care about it, like, as a character of its own. And we just don't get that with Camp Jupiter, like, at all. Like, we don't spend all that much time there, as, like, after Percy has spent, what, at best, a couple of days there, he goes on a quest that takes him to Alaska, and then almost immediately joins the other characters on the Argo 2 to go globetrotting. And it's honestly not long after that that the Romans leave Camp Jupiter to go and attack Camp Half-Blood. Meaning, like, we hardly ever get to spend any time there. And the Romans get set up to destroy Camp Half-Blood, you know, a place we actually do care about. I mean, the only reason we remotely care about Camp Jupiter at all is because Percy wants to build a future there with Annabeth, and we care about Percy, and the Roman demigods want to save it as well. I mean, it's one of the most disappointing aspects about Heroes of Olympus, just kind of like compounded by the fact that we as an audience are constantly told it's great through guys like Percy wanting to live there, but we're never shown why it's great. And I mean, this is made so much worse by the fact that Jason, a character who could have been excellently utilized to provide us with reasons to care about Camp Jupiter at all, instead is conflicted because he actually wants to go and live at Camp Half-Blood, but he just feels kind of like duty-bound to not abandon Camp Jupiter. It's ridiculous. Everything about Camp Jupiter and the Roman aspects of the gods feels just half-baked in a way to either give Percy and Annabeth a happily ever after, or to just push the plot forward. Like, none of it feels truly, like, organic or lived in, the way the Greek mythology felt in the Percy Jackson books. And while this has left the antagonists and, the world building in dire straits, the thing that really just dealt the death blow to the Heroes of Olympus series was the character writing. The Percy Jackson books were built off of the back of just phenomenal character writing. Percy was relatable, yet realistic as a young boy, thrust into a world much bigger and more powerful than himself. He fought adversity throughout the books, forcing him to grow and change and become better, both as a person and as a warrior. But he wasn't written into the role of a Mary Sue, because despite his incredible power, he still failed. He had issues in his relationships that required him to take on new perspectives in order to change. He's a really well-written protagonist. And I mean, the use of side characters, the characters Percy would surround himself with, bond with, antagonize, or develop alongside, was captivating to read about. One of the smartest writing decisions Rick Riordan made was in swapping out a character that Percy would quest with. In The Lightning Thief, right, Percy's joined by Grover and Annabeth, who kind of act as his guides to this strange new world he's found himself in, all while their relationships are strengthened throughout the story, In the Sea of Monsters, Grover's captured by the Cyclops Polyphemus, and replaced in Percy's group by Percy's half-brother Tyson, another Cyclops. And I mean, this gives us insight into Percy and Annabeth, their budding relationship, while endearing us to this new character. In the Titan's Curse, Annabeth is captured by Luke and Atlas and replaced by Thalia, or Thalia, however you want to say it, a daughter of Zeus, allowing us to see kind of her relationship and rivalry with Percy. The Battle of the Labyrinth puts Percy, Grover, Annabeth, and Tyson all together, allowing us to really see just how close they've all come to be with each other, while also throwing in Nico and Rachel to put a strain on those relationships before, a whole cast of characters really needs to come together in The Last Olympian to work together to defeat Kronos. I mean, it's such a simple writing device, but it allows so much character to be built and explored. Especially because throughout the whole series, we're in Percy's head. Being in Percy's head also just has the benefit of meaning that we experience the story solely from his point of view. This means that on rereads, we can, infer a lot from other characters that Percy maybe just isn't noticing. I mean, a prime example of this is, the growing romantic tension between him and Annabeth, which he only realizes there, midway through the 4th book, if you're being generous, I'd go so far as say like midway through the 5th book. But because we're only in his head, rereading the series allows us to kind of see the struggles Annabeth is going through over her feelings for Luke and Percy. That Percy's basically just completely oblivious to. I mean, all of this leads to the relationships in the Percy Jackson books feeling nuanced, and above all else, they feel natural and earned. And this is in stark contrast to the Heroes of Olympus series, where it never feels like any of the character work lands. Starting the series with The Lost Hero, a book following a completely new character, was a bold choice, and honestly, one that I think was a mistake. I mean, not only are we kind of flitting through 3 POVs, but I don't find any of them to be interesting. Like, Jason was always going to be a struggle, like, because he spends pretty much the entire book not knowing who he is. And I mean, with almost no way for the audience to kind of know before he does. Like, God, it makes it an absolute nightmare to try and, like, relate to him as a character. And throughout the rest of the series, like, characters try and hype him up as, like, you know, just as powerful as Percy, you know, who would they, you know, someone who could match Percy, like, blow for blow, if it came down to that. Only for the actions to show us a guy who gets his ass kicked all the time, to the point where it becomes a joke in unrelated books that he's constantly getting knocked unconscious. Piper is honestly one of my least favorite characters in the entire series. Her whole reason for being seems to be to, like, critique more feminine girls, especially because she's like this daughter of Aphrodite, but she's like a tomboy. But the writing is so blunt, without any hint of nuance, that it just becomes a chore to read. I mean, her only other through line beyond just, I'm not a girly girl, woe is me, Aphrodite's my mom, how will these two things coexist, is, oh my god, I just want to date Jason. The writing is almost paradoxical because of it. Like, having her denounce more typical Aphrodite girls, but then spend the vast majority of her time in her chapters gushing about the boy she likes, like a stereotypical view of an Aphrodite girl. Oh god, this leads to one of Riordan's other big issues that we will tackle later. Because before we do, I gotta talk about Leo. Now, I'm well aware that the Percy Jackson fanbase loves Leo. But I'm sorry, if it weren't for Piper, he would be my least favorite character. And I mean, it's such a pity because he had so much potential. But he not only gets, like, rocketed up to, like, head of Hephaestus' cabin for seemingly no reason, but it is so annoying being in his head when he is constantly making jokes that don't land and constantly pining over being a third wheel. And then he gets trapped in this, like, weird quasi-love triangle with Frank and Hazel. Are you seeing a pattern, I wonder? If you are, put it on the back burner, because we will get to it. But one of the worst aspects of The Lost Hero is that Jason, Piper, and Leo all have false memories of these lives that they haven't really lived. But when it's revealed that it's false, they just fall back into these roles anyway. Jason and Leo are, like, best friends. Piper and Jason are dating. Like, it feels so weird and forced. I mean, especially with Jason insisting the entire book that these relationships aren't real. And then by the end, agreeing like, nah, they're real now, we've been through stuff, we've built these relationships. And all of that is not even talking about the pacing of the actual book itself. But I mean, to be fair, the other characters aren't that much better either. Like, Frank and Hazel are introduced as Percy's new friends in The Son of Neptune. And to be completely fair here, I like Frank a lot. He's a really interesting character, like the son of the war god Mars, who doesn't really like what his dad stands for and kind of wishes that he had a different godly parent, before kind of growing and realizing that war isn't really all that Mars stands for. You know, he's got his own insecurities that he needs to work through, as well as like this really interesting problem where his life force is tied to just this burning stick that really makes him so interesting and nuanced. His romantic interest in Hazel kind of works, to be honest, with regards to like his insecurities. It's just unfortunate that Hazel isn't that great of a character. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'd take her over any of the three protagonists from The Lost Hero. But she really just feels like a watered down Nico. I mean, a daughter of Pluto who's a girl out of time and, feels she can't relate to her peers because of that. As opposed to Nico, a son of Hades, who's a boy out of time and feels like he can't relate to his peers because of that. It's honestly infuriating to read. And I mean, bloody hell, all of the characters get along so well. There's never any real tension between them. They never feel like a bunch of teenagers thrown together and forced to cooperate, because there's hardly ever any issues between them that aren't due to external forces. I mean, in the Percy Jackson books, right, Percy didn't start out liking every character he went on a quest with. Like, he and Annabeth needed to work on their relationship due to their flaws kind of causing them to clash, as well as the issues their godly parents had with each other. Percy had to come to understand Zoe Nightshade and her perspectives because they didn't like each other for the vast majority of the Titan's Curse, all while him and Thalia are just stepping on each other's toes and fighting because they both believe they are right and they should lead because their instincts are correct. And then his hard-earned relationship with Annabeth is just jeopardized because he's an oblivious, idiotic teenage boy to both Annabeth and Rachel's attraction to him. Like, all of this makes the characters feel real and relatable. And none of it's present in any meaningful way in Heroes of Olympus. And mainly because of the elephant in the room. All of the characters are so focused on the romance. The romance between the characters is front and center throughout the Heroes of Olympus series. And unfortunately, it can't hold a candle to what Riordan was able to do with Percy and Annabeth in the Percy Jackson series. Their relationship developed organically through each book, with its own tensions and obstacles, before finally paying off in the last book with them getting together. In Heroes of Olympus, the romantic relationships are just rushed and never feel like there are any true obstacles in the way of them kind of coming to fruition. It causes the characters just become insufferable after a while, as they're either pining after someone or worrying about their relationship. And the worst part is, I don't think Rick Riordan is bad at writing romance. I mean, Percy and Annabeth remain a shining example of romantic character writing even throughout Heroes of Olympus. But, they had this history the audience cared about. And because of that history, were secure in their relationship. Meaning that, throughout Heroes of Olympus, that relationship is just refining itself as they face adversity together. Because all of the other characters get together after their first book, it never feels earned. And it felt like Rick did everything in his power to to pair up as many characters as possible. I mean, he even paired up Nico by the end, which, by the way, Nico being gay could have been infinitely more interesting. Now, I have no problem with him being gay. True, I wish, at the very least, it was kind of hinted at, or even, like, established in the Percy Jackson series. But the real problem that I had with Nico being gay was that it would have worked so much better if he was one of the POV characters throughout Heroes of Olympus, and he didn't just have his sexuality revealed in Jason's chapter, and with us only getting one book to explore Nico from his POV in the final book of the series. Couple that with the fact that, you know, he didn't even willingly reveal his sexuality, and that's awesome. But leaving Nico aside, this invasive romance angle was thrust on what felt like every single character. Tyson fell for the harpy Ella, Jason and Piper fell for each other, Frank and Hazel fell for each other, Percy and Annabeth were together, naturally, Coach Hedge spends the entire series worrying about his pregnant wife, and Raina and Leo spent the entire series pining after someone to love, with, you know, Raina eventually realizing that she didn't actually need anyone, and Leo getting paired off with Calypso in what I found to not only be an uninteresting romance, but also a romance that seemed to try and, like, cast Percy in a bad light because the gods didn't follow through on their promise of releasing Calypso, as if that's Percy's fault. So much for trying, eh, homies? Ultimately, Heroes of Olympus felt rushed, unorganized, and just uninspired. It felt like Rick wanted to write more books because there were, like, more aspects of Greek and Roman myth that he wanted to highlight, without ever having a story he truly wanted to, like, tell to go along with it. And I mean, he also just fell headfirst into the trap of telling us instead of showing us. A trap he masterfully avoided in the Percy Jackson books, allowing readers to just read between the lines and giving those books a sense of longevity and rereadability, you know? The new characters were bland, shoehorned into just bad romance stories that were just never adequately developed, and then thrust into a world that wasn't quite able to expand enough to fit them in. Which is honestly a shame, because there was so much potential in the series that ultimately felt like it went unfulfilled. But I mean, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean there aren't aspects to enjoy or that you shouldn't read the books. They are worth your time, especially if you enjoyed Percy Jackson. Just understand that they can't hold a candle to that first series. And I mean, having said all that, you know, this breakdown was pretty heavily slanted in the Percy Jackson book's favor. You know, I didn't really touch on what Heroes of Olympus kind of did well, or where Percy Jackson stumbled. So I mean, if those are videos something you'd be interested in seeing, you know, let me know. Because at the end of the day, I absolutely love just talking about this world and diving into things like Percy and Annabeth's relationship, why Luke is a pretty problematic character, you know, how Nico and Raina have such interesting development on paper, but not so great execution, you know? Or even how Percy and Jason's relationship could have absolutely been the best part of Heroes of Olympus. I've got a lot of thoughts on that. So, you know, if you are someone who loved the Heroes of Olympus series, let me know. Maybe I'll get around to, you know, why those books are an awesome series, despite their flaws. And ultimately, thank you for watching. I really do appreciate it. I wonder how many people are gonna be pissed off with me that I called Leo like the worst character. Because I know there are so many posts about how Leo is just the best and he's this great character. Like I'm mad curious.